Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to have coming up for sale in their February of 2018 regional auction. Specifically today, a 9mm SITES Spectre pistol. Now, when we're looking at this, the important thing to keep in mind the whole time is that this was designed to be a submachine gun. And the fact that it is in pistol form is a secondary priority for the company. So, SITES was founded in Torino in Italy in the early 1980s. It is the Societa Italiana de Technologie Speciali, SITS. Acronym is SITES. And what they initially intended to do was come up with the best, most modern submachine gun design for government counterterrorism police sort of use. So they looked at a bunch of the different designs that were out there, figured, okay, what do we need to do? What are some of the common shortcomings of police submachine guns? And they came up with a number of interesting conclusions. They wanted to keep the gun compact. They wanted the gun narrow. They wanted the gun unobtrusive. And they really did pull that off. The Spectre, while, again, this is why we have to consider this as a submachine gun and not as a pistol. Because as a pistol, it's massively huge and bulky and awkward. As a submachine gun, remember that the stock is not on it so that it can be legally a pistol. As a submachine gun, it's quite narrow. It's something like 35 millimeters wide, less than 1.5 inches wide. It has no major protrusions on the side. It is, in this form, set up with a 30-round magazine, which is substantially shorter than a typical magazine because they used quad stack mags instead of double stack. So the controls are unobtrusive, the bolt handle's unobtrusive. They came up with a number of good ideas for this gun. The problem came that there wasn't really a whole lot of demand for a new police submachine gun. While they may have had the best one, the second best one was really just fine as it was. So that's where SITES started running into problems. And they eventually, they put this into production as the Model 2, this is a Model 4, in 1985, fairly quickly upgraded it to the Model 4. They made a number of changes. They simplified the takedown, they improved the sights, they improved the stock, which originally was a top folding stock, to again keep the gun nice and narrow, allow it to be short for concealment if necessary. Side folding stocks, of course, typically double the width of the gun, so they went with a top folding stock instead. But they just weren't able to make any sales. So one of their solutions was to redesign it slightly as a semi-automatic pistol and carbine. These were imported into the US from the late 1980s until 1993. At that point, import shut down because of the US assault weapons bans. This absolutely qualified as an assault pistol under that law because of things like the barrel shroud, the magazine being forward of the grip assembly, various other features. The company stayed in business. Well, we'll touch on where this eventually went after we take a closer look at how it actually works. All right, the basics first. It is chambered for 9x19mm, standard 9mm parabellum. We have, this is a 30-round magazine. As I mentioned, this is a quad stack magazine, so 4 columns of cartridges in there, which narrow to 2 columns up in the top of the magazine and then narrow into a single column for actual feeding into the gun. So I suspect a loading tool would be very helpful in actually loading this thing. We'll take the floor plate off in a minute and I'll show you what's actually inside a quad stack magazine. This thing is pretty heavy. As a pistol, for a submachine gun, it would be not too terribly bad. It comes in at just under 6.5 pounds unloaded. That's just under 3 kilograms. Balanced, well, add a stock to it and it would be very nice. Controls are pretty basic and completely ambidextrous. So the magazine release is here inside the magazine well, or inside the trigger guard. And then we have a safety in front, fire on top, safe below, and a decocking lever in the back. This is another one of those elements that makes sense in the context of a submachine gun and not so much in the context of a pistol. The idea there is basically to give you a double action style of much longer and much heavier trigger pull rather than a manual safety. So rendering the gun safe simply because of the weight of the trigger pull like you would with a double action revolver, However, it's still allowing the gun to be fired with just a straight trigger pull without the shooter having to use any controls. And then the bolt handle is up here, just laying across the top of the gun. Grab that and cycle it backwards like so. This is one of the changes they made between the Model 2 and the Model 4. The Model 2 had a more Uzi-like kind of a charging handle knob on top, and they replaced it with this flat piece, which I think does make sense. Now, this is a closed bolt gun, and it was a closed bolt gun from the very beginning of design. In many cases, you'll find semi-automatic variations of submachine guns where they had to convert guns from open bolt to closed bolt. This is not one of them. That closed bolt design gives the gun a number of advantages. You don't have the kerchunk of the entire bolt mechanism dropping forward when you actually fire the first round. That makes some closed bolt guns typically more accurate as a practical matter than open bolt ones. You'll see the HK-MP5 is a closed bolt submachine gun, and a large part of its reputation for accuracy comes from that fact. And you get the same thing here. Having a closed bolt also takes care of a lot of the couple of typical submachine gun open bolt safety issues about what happens if the bolt bounces backwards and strips a cartridge off. Well, as a closed bolt gun, it doesn't have a fixed firing pin. You don't have to worry about any of those issues. So that was something I think SITES did right. Closed bolt really does make sense for a modern submachine gun, I think. There are just a couple of markings on here to take a look at. SITES, company name, Spectre. This is, of course, the pistol model made in Italy and patented. And then on this side, we have our importer marks, FIE out of Miami, Florida, and the ever helpful read warnings before using, manual free from FIE Miami, Florida. I don't think anyone ever pays attention to that on firearms any more than they do on any other commercial product. And we have a serial number up in front of the ejection port, which is repeated on the bottom of the barrel as well. The front sight is just a standard round post, adjustable for elevation, a couple of nice big protective wings on it. The rear sight is just a rear notch, no provision for windage adjustment. This is just a pin to hold it in place. You may be looking at that and saying, that looks an awful lot like a big spring-loaded catch. And you would be correct. This is a big spring-loaded catch. Right now, the grip is, the trigger assembly is locking it in place, but this is a critical part of our disassembly. So let's move on to that. There is one pin that you take out, and it is also the sling swivel here. It is held captive by this little doodly bit right there. So if we flip that out, then I can take the pin, pull it out. Now, normally the idea of having a sling swivel and a disassembly pin on the same component seems a little unwise, but in this case they had a couple of extra precautions so that if you should manage to actually yank that pin out, which thanks to the little locking tab right there, isn't all that likely to happen. But even if you do, the gun still doesn't just fly apart. So the grip assembly comes off, but only when you push the recoil assembly here in. There we go. I should have dropped the bolt first, but when I pushed this in and pulled the grip assembly down, it dropped the bolt for me. So just to go over that one more time, you push this end plate in just slightly. That allows the grip frame to come out because there is a locking bar or locking catch right there. So you can see that, and that is locking into this slightly angled wedge on the back of the grip frame. So there's our trigger assembly. We'll take a close look at how this all works in a moment. See, now I push this in and push down the latch, and that allows the rear cap and its two dual springs to come out. And then the latch, and we get our bolt and striker. There is the field stripped Spectre. Interesting to note that they have actually used the same system that is typically used for a semi-auto conversion of an open bolt gun. Namely, they have a bolt that goes all the way forward with a firing pin in it, and then this separate, you could call this a linear hammer, or well, linear hammer is actually probably the correct term. This thing is what's under pressure from one of these two main springs. You've got one that pushes on the bolt and one that pushes on this block. And when this goes forward, it smacks the firing pin and fires the gun. So this is the front part of the bolt assembly. In fact, this is the bolt itself. We have a firing pin there. It's spring-loaded, and in fact, you have to hit it pretty hard to get it to come through. In fact, even if it just pushes flush, it doesn't protrude out the front. So it has to be given enough impact to actually get some inertia and push farther forward than just flush against this. So that is an extra safety precaution. If the linear hammer doesn't come far enough back, if this jumps over the sear and closes without enough force, it still won't fire the gun. Anyway, note that there is a hole for the recoil spring in the back. So the smaller diameter recoil spring goes in there. That's a blind hole. So this spring is pushing on the bolt the whole time. This is our linear hammer, which sits on top of that guy. There we go. So this small spring goes right through the linear hammer and doesn't do anything to it. It's pushing always on the bolt itself. Now when this fires, the hammer here hits the back of the bolt, like so, and pushes the firing pin out. The second of our main springs goes over the top of the first one, and it sits on a shoulder. You can see that it doesn't go through there. There is actually, you can see it right there, there's a little stepped shoulder on the inside of the hammer that stops this mainspring. So as with pretty much all guns of this design, you need a spring for the bolt and a spring for the hammer, and this does it with two springs that are nested over the top of each other. One of the neat things about the hammer on the Spectre, the whole fire control group, is that it has a disconnector here that's actually sideways. So you'll see that there is a hole in the receiver there. This hammer is going to travel in here, forward and back, and at its rearmost point of travel, it comes to right there. So when it's running backwards, there's a slot right here that allows this, which is the single action firing release, that travels in that slot like so. And when the hammer is going backwards, you can hear it snap right there. It pushes this out of the way, comes in front, and then this pops back into place, and that angled surface locks against this to hold the thing ready, cocked, ready to fire. Then, when you pull the trigger, the relevant part here is this sort of T-shaped piece at the bottom. So, when I don't have the trigger pulled, this piece can't go far enough down to release the hammer. When I pull the trigger, that bar goes back. Now, that release can drop all the way. That releases the hammer, and the gun fires. Now, when the striker goes forward, it's going to push over the top of this, and that's going to disconnect the trigger. This doesn't really want to return. There we go. It disconnects it so that the trigger is now held below this bar and can't do anything until I fully release the trigger, at which point it pops back up. Sorry, it misbehaves a bit when the rest of the gun's not there. Then you can see now when I pull the trigger, it's able to push that bar back. Once it has fired and we pop it down, that can't happen. The safety does pretty much the same thing. When I engage the safety, it drops this sear right here so that the trigger no longer engages on this T-shaped piece, doesn't push it backwards, and thus doesn't fire the gun. So actually a pretty simple safety. Now the other bit here that gets trickier is the decocker and the double action mode. And in double action, we actually have this little finger that pushes backward, and not very far, as you can see. However, that is pushing on this surface of the hammer, and you can see that it forces the hammer backwards when you pull the trigger. What that is doing is pushing the hammer back against its spring, not so far as to back here, which is where it would fire from single action, but far enough that it can still drop and set off a primer. So this is why if you use the decocker, you only get one shot before it has to actually cycle, or you have to cycle the bolt in order to do it a second time. This isn't like a double action revolver where the double action pull can be run as many times as you want. You only get one chance at this, because once you drop it to here, that finger can no longer reach up and grab the hammer. So when it's back here and then you release it with the decocker, what you're doing is dropping it to this position. And then when you fire, this finger pushes it back until it drops under the hammer. The hammer then goes forward, and that's your one chance. Now, the way the decocking lever actually works is that this lever has this little sort of shark fin look to it right here. When you pull it down, it's going to pull that T-bar backwards far enough that our firing release can actually drop the bolt. However, it's not moving this guy. So if I pull the trigger, this guy goes back and down at the same time that this drops. That leaves everything free to fire. If I use this lever to do it, this can drop down. Remember, this is always under spring pressure from the bolt. It's being pushed downward. This drops down, the hammer goes forward, and it gets caught by that finger, ready to fire double action. Whew, that is a doozy of a fire control mechanism to explain. Now, in theory, what I read is that there is a forced air ventilation, clever forced air ventilation system to this gun to help cool it. I don't see any evidence of that. Maybe there was something that was on the submachine guns that they simplified and removed from the pistols, but until I have a chance to take a look at an actual legitimate submachine gun Spectre, I have no way to tell. So one last thing to take a look at is the magazine. I said we'd take this apart. There is a floor plate with a hole, and I can use the recoil spring guide to pop that down. We'll just push this backwards. The inside of this magazine is a little bit grungy, but we have one floor plate that has guides for 2 recoil springs, or 2 magazine springs. We've got 2 springs in there, one for each column of this magazine. And then if I just pop it down, we have one kind of interesting looking follower. So the follower here is split in 2 halves, and the left side has this steel roller in it. You'll notice that there are slots cut in the follower, and on the inside of the magazine you don't actually have a complete separation between the 2 columns, just a pair of guide rails like that. So the follower can sit over. Yeah, it's hard to hold this up into the camera when it's upside down. The follower can sit here and run on those rails, hence you don't have to have 2 separate followers. This roller is just there to help the cartridges converge from 4 to 2 to a single stack at the top. There are a couple of witness holes on the side, so you know when you're loading it, when it's fully loaded. This is the 30-round version. There is a 50-round version that was also made. And as SITES was very proud of, the 50-round quad stack mag is approximately the same length as a typical 30-round double stack magazine. In order to minimize cost of the gun, the whole trigger assembly frame, the grip assembly, was made out of a polymer or a resin fiberglass plasticky thing. And then the whole upper receiver, so the rear end of the receiver itself, the magazine well, the barrel shroud, all of that started out as one flat steel stamping, which was then bent around a mandrel. You can see there's a pair of rails that are stamped into the receiver here to help make sure the bolt stays in its proper track. And then you can see where it was welded on the bottom. See the weld seam on the inside of the magazine well there. They finished it much better on the outside, kind of like the PPSH. This gap was left open because why bother? You don't really need to close it. And then it was welded pretty nicely right up there at the muzzle. Just to put it in context, the single action trigger pull, it has a lot of travel, in fact, a lot of travel. And then at the very end, you can't really tell when it's going to break, but it's got a pretty nice light break to it. When you decock it, you then have a far heavier, I mean, that's like a really heavy trigger pull because you're camming the linear hammer backward, and then it finally breaks and fires. So eventually, SITES, the original company, went defunct in 1997. The rights and production and everything to the gun were purchased by a Swiss company called Greco Sport. They continued manufacturing the gun until 2001. Remember, this wasn't, of course, imports into the US had ended in 93, but they were selling these in other countries, in places in Europe, other places where they could sell a semi-automatic pistol or carbine. And of course, they were still trying to sell submachine guns. Greco Sport went out of business in 2006. And that's kind of the end of the line for the Spectre submachine gun. I should also point out, in Europe, I believe this was sold under the name Falcon. Spectre is specifically for the US market. Not sure why they thought they needed different names, but they did. Ultimately, while this one is in 9mm, you will also find them in 40 Smith & Wesson in the US, and they also manufactured a version in 9x21 IMI. I would presume for the Italian market, which at the time had a restriction on civilian ownership of military cartridges like 9x19. They also apparently made a 45 ACP version, although I don't think those ever were sold in substantial numbers in the US. So it is again, you have to look at this thing as a submachine gun, because as a subgun, it's actually a pretty cool gun, and a lot of its features make a lot of sense. In a pistol form, it's obviously been substantially handicapped for that original role. But it does make a pretty cool piece of, well, there are a lot of people interested in semi-automatic conversions of actual submachine guns. So this is a pretty cool one of a modern submachine gun that you don't typically see, because of course they never managed to sell very many of the actual submachine guns. Anyway, if you'd like to have this one, take a look at the description text below. There is a link there to Rock Island's upcoming auction. For this, on their catalog page, you can see all their details, their pictures, etc., and place a bid right through the web if you're inclined. Thanks for watching.